So good evening, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this evening seminar featuring the newly qualified Dr. John Pearce, who will be presenting his findings on the nature of public outdoor education in Ireland. So my name is Stephen Hannon, and I'm a lecturer in outdoor education at GMIT. And my role this evening is to get this evening underway and to moderate the panel discussion that comes after John's presentation. When John suggested this seminar to me, I thought it was a great idea. Often PhD studies don't get to reach out to the world they have examined, and perhaps this can limit their impact. I suppose the function of the academic is to reflect on, question, challenge, and create opportunities for dialogue about the subject of their study. This dialogue has the potential to contribute to improving practice, and perhaps this dialogue can start here this evening. The format of this evening's seminar is that John will begin with a presentation of his findings. This will be followed by some questions from the panel. We have a panel here from the outdoor sector in Ireland. And then the final part of the evening will include questions from you, the audience. In terms of housekeeping, maybe people could include their observations and questions in the chat box as we go along. And I'll try and get to as many of them as possible after we've spoken with the panel. So that's it. Pull your chair a little closer to the screen, and I'll hand you over to Dr. John Pearce to begin his presentation.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and thanks for the introduction, and thanks everyone else for attending tonight. I hope you find it very interesting, and as Stephen was saying, the whole idea here is to try and create some discussion around outdoor education in Ireland. And just on the question bit, like Stephen was talking about there in the chat, this being the first PhD study in outdoor education in Ireland to look at the outdoor centres, it's probably going to raise more questions than it answers. So if you're sitting there looking for the ultimate answer to all the questions about it all, I'm not sure, you might be disappointed. But just keep in mind, it's very much a discussion based presentation, or to generate discussion, excuse me. So to move on, we're going to cover a number of different topics tonight. The first thing we're going to do is just very briefly go through my background in terms of who I am to be studying outdoor education at this level. So a brief background for those of you who don't know me. Once that's done, there's a couple of slides on the study itself in terms of how the data was generated and what I did with the data then to make the findings happen, or to generate the findings after that. So there'll be a couple of slides there on the background of the, I suppose, the research and how it was done. Once we get through that, I'll introduce the 4 key findings, and I'll explain a little bit about them and try and give a few examples of them as well from the data that was generated. Once that's finished with, it'll be, onto the conclusions and maybe some potential shifts that could happen as examples for the sector in the future. That'll be at the end of the presentation, and we'll move on then to the panel discussion that Stephen was talking about there. So 5 sections, and we'll see how we get on going with them. Okay, so my background, I've spent over 20 years now working in outdoor education in Ireland. I've worked as an outdoor instructor, I've worked training outdoor instructors and even training the people who train the outdoor instructors. And my current job as a lecturer, if I can get to work, there we go, is in the Munster Technological University in the southwest of Ireland. So it's down there at the southwestern edge. And I decided to start doing this study really as an idea to try and see how we could improve the sector. And I suppose what I found over the years of working in different centres and freelancing and training people at different levels, I found that the practice I was doing, what I was doing in the centres and in my own practice, and what I saw happening around me was quite different to what I'd read about in the books during my degree and after it. And that's kind of where I started to approach this study from, in terms of why is there this difference between what the books are saying and how the practice actually happens in the centres. That was my perception at the time, and that's what got me going with it. So that's a little bit of background. In terms of the study itself, the study had two research aims. The first one was to critically examine the practice of public outdoor education in Ireland. Basically, I was trying to focus on understanding the day-to-day practice that goes on in the centres. So it wasn't focused on program outcomes or what happens and the benefits from it. It was very much looking at, well, what goes on in these places? How do they tick? What happens all the time in them? And the second one, the second name of it was to try and figure out if and how the public outdoor education practice has been influenced by society in different ways. This presentation kind of more focuses on the first aim in terms of the stuff I talk about, but the two of them are kind of interlinked a lot, so they'll both come up. The overall aim here was to try to generate some evidence around what happens in the centres, and to understand why it is the way it is. Excuse me. Apologies for that. That's my bad. Sorry. So yeah, that's what the study was focused on, to try and look at what goes on in the centres and how it's come to be that way. That's basically the idea of it. So in terms of what I did to collect the data and generate the findings, I did a thing called an ethno case study, which sounds very fancy, but I'll explain it to you now. It hopefully won't be too bad. In terms of a case, I was working with 4 different outdoor education and training centres, and each one of those was a case. So everything that happened in that centre or around that centre was part of that one case. And there was 4 of them. And the ethno bit is just about what kind of data I gathered together. So there was a couple of different types. I did a lot of participant observation. I spent a lot of time in the centres observing and helping out and recording what was going on, while also chatting with the staff along the way. And each of the 4 centres was, excuse me, very kind to provide me with some documentation like their operating procedures and things like that. And I analysed them along with the websites. The idea here being the websites looked at, I suppose, the public face of outdoor education and what it's in outdoor education training centres and what they say to the public. The operating procedures being I suppose, the private face that they tell their staff what they want them to do. And then the observations and chats were more of a comparison to see how the stuff they said to the public and to their staff happened in practice in actual time. So I gathered all this data, loads of it, got it all together, and I analysed it. I won't go into detail on the analysis process, but it was about 6 or 7 different layers of analysis that eventually came up with the final teams. And the final teams are basically just 4, how would you describe it? Areas of commonality around the data. So things that were the same when fit into these things. The 4 of them, I don't have on a slide, but the 4 of the teams at the end were daily practice, learning, technical skills focus, and teaching strategy. So that's how all the data was grouped at the end of the analysis phases. What happened next then was, once you have all the stuff analyzed, you'd with these kind of research studies, you'd interpret it through some kind of theoretical lens. And I chose this idea of McDonaldization of society by this guy, George Ritzer. And basically what you're doing here is you take the components of the theory you're using and you try and interpret and see where those things are within the teams you've created. There was 5 aspects to this McDonaldization theory. The first one was efficiency. The next one is calculability. So obviously efficiency is looking at making things more efficient or how efficient they are in the first place. Calculability is able to calculate what you're doing in terms of how many staff you might need or how many buses or whatever, things like that. Predictability is knowing how it's going to work out. And control then is being able to manage things and make sure they happen the way you want them to. And I suppose just as a side note on this theory, lots of one of these or not a lot of one of these isn't necessarily good or bad. It's just the way it is. Generally what tends to happen is once we start to try and become more efficient, more calculated, more predictable and more controlled, that we keep going and keep going and keep going to get more and more and more of it. And usually this is quite good and it can be quite a useful thing to have happening. But after a while, this 5th aspect can come in, not always, but it can't come in, and it's called the irrationality of rationality. That's a very fancy term. Basically, it means that when you have too much of one of these other four things, it can be less efficient or less predictable or less controlled or less calculated as a result. Don't worry if that doesn't make much sense. Hopefully when I get to explaining the through examples later on, it'll make a bit more sense. So what I did to come up with the findings was I had the teams and I interpreted through this theory here. Another somewhat novel aspect of this study was how the findings have been presented. So the findings have been written as a creative nonfiction story. I go between story and stories. It's my own brain not working well. So there's two different days. So sometimes I'll say story and sometimes I'll say stories. Basically what happened was this creative nonfiction thing is a fictionalized account of the actual events. So the things I read and saw are real, I suppose, and I wrote them up in a fictionalized way. And the idea here was to try and keep the focus on practice, not the practitioners or not the centers themselves. So these four centers were a representative sample that they were diverse enough to show practice across the country. But you guys all, as most of you guys will know, outdoor education in Ireland is quite a small community of people, and you guys could easily find out who was who. So to be able to truly be able to stand over this study ethically, I had to try and come up with a way of providing an anonymity to the people who took part. And that's how I did it there, was creating these 2 days of stories that represent the findings. So basically the different activities, the different people, the different places all got merged and twisted together to create these stories. So there's different bits in different places coming together to represent the findings. It's not a new technique, but it's relatively new to outdoor education research. So that's that. In terms of the research findings, then there was 4 findings. What I'll do is I'll just lay them out on this slide. I'll just name the 4 of them out, and I have a number of slides coming after this that will hopefully explain them in more detail for you. So the first slide was, or the first finding was the McDonaldization of outdoor education. The second one is a lack of engagement with theory. The next one was programming by logistics. And the final one was ideological dissonance. So that's the 4 findings that came after the interpretation of the final themes through the theoretical lens. I will move on now and I'll try and explain some of them to you guys. So, excuse me. I'm going to split, because there's 5 aspects of McDonaldization, I'm going to split it up into 2, 2, and then 1, just to make it a bit easier to go through. So what the findings show in those stories is a very calculated and predictable practice across the outdoor centers. An example there would be, in terms of kind of predictable and calculating stuff, is when once the centers knew how many students were coming in, they could make up a table of which activities and which instructors would be where they were, and it'd be very calculated and predictable way of running the programs and sessions. You literally have a table on the wall saying the AM sessions, the morning sessions, the afternoon sessions, who's on doing what, and it'll be very structured in that sense. And what can happen there with that kind of if it gets overly calculated and overly predictable, it can lead to trying to complete activities as opposed to focusing on what the students are learning. And that's something that kind of came across sometimes with some other practitioners. It would be very much a focus of, we have to complete the activity, we have to complete this and do a certain amount of this activity. And it didn't really matter how much the students had chosen to do this or not. This is how we ended up focusing on it. And that's slightly, that is just what was found there. The next one then, in terms of efficiency and control, a similar idea, when things got overly efficient and overly controlled, they tended to become, again, very task focused. So trying to get the task done. I'll give an example. There would have been times when you're in the middle of a session and it would stop to try and control it and then put them back out to do what was going on, as opposed to saying that these guys didn't want that, they wanted to do something else. So we could actually adapt the session to what they wanted. It was very much controlled from the center's point of view. yeah, so success would be like not capsizing or making it to the top of the climb or getting everyone to do a big jump off something. And the more complex stuff like social skills and personal development became less apparent, even though, as I said already, I wasn't looking for those kind of things at the same time. So the final bit of the McDonaldization one, in terms of that irrationality of rationality, was things had gotten so efficient and so controlled within what I was watching that there were some irrational things happening. I've got two examples to throw at you on that one to try and help with understanding what that irrationality thing is. So the egg task is the first one I'll talk about. That was during a kind of team building or team bonding session. There was eggs involved in other activities that were really good. And then out of some kind of evolution over time, there was a task where the group had to link arms in a circle and they all kind of leant forward into like a table shape almost. And there was eggs thrown up above their heads, raw eggs. And if they moved, they were chicken. That was the task. I'm not sure how it was meant to be team building or bonding or any of those kind of things, but that's what happened. And it's a result of this idea of the more we get efficient and the more we get controlling of these things, the more it can become less and less actually efficient and truly controlled for what it needs to be. The second one, the quote there from one of the instructors that was involved in the research says, "I feel like I'm cheating today." That was around the day that was, it was a bit of a stormy day, and the staff believed that the normal sessions wouldn't have worked too well. So there was a group of teenagers that had a certain kind of special interest group, if you want to call it that. I want to give away who they were. And it was decided at short notice to create a day that would play to the interests of the group themselves. So they went on a bit of a tour around looking at things that were interesting to that group. But it wasn't focused on adventure sports or the normal run of what happens in these centres. So halfway through the day, the senior staff involved in it did say, "I feel like I'm cheating today," which was a bit, I suppose, weird is a good word for it, that it was the one time when it was actually much more focused on what the students would be interested in. And yeah, the staff were so unused to that kind of approach, not being in full control or not having that very efficient, predictable session, that yeah, they felt like they were cheating. So that's that first finding of McDonaldization of outdoor education. The next finding then, a lack of engagement with theory. Yeah, within the data set, there was very little evidence of theory being applied in practice. And what I mean by that is most areas of education, be it early years, primary, secondary, further education, higher education, youth reach, all those kind of places, all those kind of sectors have a guiding curricular framework or some kind of document like that that informs their practice and kind of shows what they're doing and what they're about. And there isn't really one for outdoor education in Ireland. We don't have that kind of a framework that's been agreed or implemented across the different centres. That's kind of where I'm coming from with that. It's slightly different to other sectors of education in that sense. And I suppose I split this up into two different sections. One was in terms of an underpinning philosophy. So why it is that we approach things the way we approach them. And the second half of that is what do we do, why we do what we do every day. So there's the bigger picture idea of what's happening every day, long term, and then the day-to-day stuff as well. If you talk to anyone from management to the newest instructor, there was a great sense of purpose, but there was no real definition of that purpose, if that makes sense. So it was quite hard to, I suppose, justify practice being the way it is or not being the way it is or being changed for some different reason, because there wasn't really much evidence to support change or staying the way it is. Whoops, my bad, sorry, excuse me. So one of the things when this practice not being underpinned by theory was that the staff focus was very much on adventure sports. I think that's fairly reasonable to conclude or to show in that finding, because most people are trained very much in adventure sports and some people solely in adventure sports provision. So without that greater purpose or that greater framework behind practice, it's quite hard to not focus on the stuff you know, I suppose. The other things here were teachers rarely engaged. So teachers or leaders, depending on the types of groups that we're in, they rarely engaged, and sometimes when they did engage, they were seen as a bit of a chore to have to do what they wanted as opposed to having the control within the center. I think that's fair enough as well, because I don't think teachers very many teachers get a lot of training in what outdoor education is or how it can be useful to them in their programs. And the students tended to do what they were told a lot. So again, modern outdoor education theory and a lot of modern education theory will talk about students having more control and being equals in the classroom or outside the classroom, and having some kind of the word agency is used quite a lot. It basically means ownership or responsibility for what's going on, or some kind of control maybe about what's happening. And they didn't tend to get that a lot. There was times when they got it, but more often than not, they wouldn't have much say in what was going on. So that's finding number 2. Finding number 3 was programming by logistics. Basically, if the group had a genuine aim for sessions, apart from just coming in and experiencing this and maybe that kind of cliched character building stuff, they were largely ignored or unknown to staff. And what did what have a bigger impact on the programming for these different groups was these logistical considerations. Things like the weather, for obvious reasons. The buses, say how many buses there was, who could drive the buses, how far away the activities were, the qualification of the staff that were on board and what they could do. Those kind of logistical issues tended to be the things that changed the program, as opposed to things changing because the group wanted a certain outcome. So there was a bit of a crossover here with these things. So they do kind of link together a lot. Yeah, so basically that's that one. And the final finding, it's called ideological dissonance. And that's a very fancy phrase for the claims of practice not necessarily matching what was observed as practice. So some of the claims within the documentation and within the websites weren't necessarily obvious to me in practice when I analyzed out the data that came to me. I'll give you some examples of that one just to support it a little bit. So there was a line in one of the documents that I had that said, outdoor education is essential to mainstream education system and curriculum, to the mainstream education system and curriculum. And while that's a good goal to have to try and make it that way, I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that it is essential. So this claim is, not necessarily match with what's happening, because I think there's one study, I can't remember the name of the authors off the top of my head, but there was one study of primary school kids and their interactions outdoors in terms of their learning in school. And there was something like 89% of the students never went outside in their primary school careers. So they're not even going outside. They're definitely not necessarily coming to outdoor education centers for these kind of things. So claims like this are a bit maybe grandiose and not necessarily there yet. That's a big picture example. If you'll forgive me a long quote, here's the next example. So I'll just read it out. After hiding along the maze route to throw water at students, the students were doing a blind maze, so they were blindfolded and following a set course. The students had water thrown on them by the teachers in this thing called Teachers' Revenge. And then the group were kept up till 2 o'clock in the morning playing basketball and soccer tournaments. No one was allowed to sleep, and the teachers splashed water on sleeping students to wake them up if they did fall asleep. I don't know what you guys think. That's clearly not really in line with what I would consider good practice in the outdoors. And this is from the teacher's point of view now, not the centers. The teachers control this completely. But the interesting bit with this quote, that's the reason it's up there, to show the kind of dissonance here is, or the difference in claims and reality, was that the reaction to the staff. So this was in the stories. This is said in the staff meeting about the night before, and the reaction to the staff was interesting. Most of the staff didn't really seem too bothered. They weren't really put out at all. They kind of went, oh, yeah, okay, grand. It seemed almost like they could fully accept this as being a good thing to do. Some of the staff less than half of them, but some of them kind of went, that doesn't really seem right to me. But again, with that lack of engagement with theory, they couldn't necessarily articulate or say why they thought that it wasn't good enough, or what could be done differently, or anything like that. So just I suppose practice within the stories, in the findings, accepted this kind of behavior from the teachers as fine, I suppose. There was they had no real issue with it. Whew. So there's the 4 findings. We'll move on to a few conclusions that have come to from the study. So again, this is over a number of years, and there's quite a big data set and a lot of time spent on pulling it apart and putting it back together in this way. I think it's fair to say that higher education in Ireland is at best a bit fragmented and aimless. It doesn't really have a set purpose. I think some of you guys mightn't like what I'm saying there, but I think every single one of us has a set purpose for what we'd like it to be, but without this kind of overarching strategy and mission and vision that we can all agree on and work towards. We all might have different purposes and different aims as we go through things. Excuse me. So I think it's a fair comment to conclude from the study. And also in terms of policy, there is very little policy, if almost no policy, for the centre to frame its practice around. We've very little research as well, and yeah, that's pretty much that one. So that's something for us to think about into the future. The other one with this as well, in terms of the claims that were made and the reality of practice, the more I've thought about it, the more I've read about it and talked to people about it, the more difficult I find seeing how methodologized adventure sport sessions can meet these curricular aims that we talk about a lot. The next slide then has some more. Generally, I think in Ireland, I think this is a fair one to conclude as well, that outdoor education is adventure sports, and vice versa. Adventure sports is outdoor education. So you talk to general public people on the street and you talk to them about outdoor education, they think kayaking, abseiling, rock climbing, sailing, getting wet and muddy in the woods, all that kind of stuff. The general public, I don't think really sees it as much more than these adventure sports. And I think sometimes, perhaps in the practitioners working in the sector as well, we forget sometimes that it doesn't have to be adventure sports. So we can do lots of other things if we have other aims to aim at. And that's, again, going back to that framework for practice to hang our hats on. And one of the things, again, I haven't gone into this in much detail in the slides before now, but one of the things about this is that the culmination of this marginalization. So this building up of marginalization within the sector, along with this focus on practitioner training in adventure sports, almost solely in adventure sports. So there's lots of marginalization in terms of outdoor education being on the fringes of education, but in lots of different ways. I could spend another half an hour easy, if not a week, talking about that. But I'll just leave it at that in terms of there are reasons beyond the control of necessarily the practitioners or the management while we're in this kind of fragmented practice. So that's some conclusions. In terms of some potential shifts, I kind of see public outdoor education in Ireland as at a crossroads. And my question would be, does it change or should it stay the same? I don't know, to be honest. This is something I'm not sure I'm not even sure I should say that in terms of I think one or the other. I don't really have an answer to that one. Purposeful change could be good, if not just change for the sake of change, but a purposeful change where the whole sector comes together and we think about it first and we try to do something different to address some of these findings from this study, or indeed just do some more research to see if these findings are as accurate as possible. So change is good, but also staying the same is good. But staying the same might mean we have to accept some of the research from here and maybe change practice as a result of that. So yeah, that's probably one of the bigger questions here in this one is, should the sector change it or should it stay the same? It would, I suppose from talking to people over the course of the research and since I've completed the research and been talking to other people in the sector, I think there's a bit of a desire for some kind of development within the sector. I think people have a bit of a yearning for more, which we can get into in the discussion panel or the questions later on maybe. But it would involve a lot of critical thinking as well in terms of just what we actually want to be doing and what could be happening. So in terms of things that could actually, some practical changes that could be brought in or not. And again, these are suggested examples, not necessarily things that should be set in stone. If it was decided not to change, if we said we're actually quite happy with practice the way it is and we just like to keep going as we are, that's great. But I think one thing that could maybe come from that is that it might be a little bit much to be calling them outdoor education and training centres if that's what we're going to be doing, if that level of practice is where it's going to stay. So my suggestion there would be to change the name to outdoor adventure training centres, as an example, which could be more representative of what the work actually is, for the most part. If we did want to change, if there was some change, look for it, and we push some development. In terms of a curricular focus in terms of education in the mainstream, perhaps a trial redeployment of the practitioners to schools. So instead of rocking up to an outdoor centre every day for work, you'd rock up to the local primary or secondary school, and that's where you'd be employed. Excuse me. And I think so. And then you'd be talking to the English teacher, the maths teacher, the science teacher, all the rest of these things, these people, and to try and see if you could help them bring their students outside. This is a good idea to me. It'd be a big leap forward in terms of outdoor education not being on the fringes anymore and being less marginalized. But from my experience, I found that teachers tend to lack in confidence and competence in leading and managing bigger groups in an outdoor setting. It's not part of their training. Whereas most outdoor instructors, that's their bread and butter. They find that quite easy to do. So you could work together to create these experiences. And I suppose going back to the adventure sports being outdoor education point earlier on, it's my belief that if this did happen, outdoor instructors would find fairly fast, I'd like to think anyway, that kayaks and rock climbing weren't necessarily the best way to go about some of these sessions the teachers wanted. They'd be brilliant for certain things, but not necessarily always the best thing to do. Maybe just sometime out in the woods looking for shapes, for example, or lots of other different things like that that I could talk about, could be as useful, if not more useful, in terms of the learning and connecting to the curriculum that these students are going through. So it might bring in more of a balance to practice, and that some adventure sports when they're needed, and then other things when they're also needed and useful. Other suggestions, again, hasn't been talked about in these slides really yet, but there's very much well, there's no national strategy in place. I think the national governing body training from adventure sports that the staff have gotten has been really effective, and people tend to do a lot of the same kind of things in different places and not necessarily take into account the places themselves. So one idea that I came across here, there was a big study done in the UK called Learning Away, where they develop all these local partnerships between schools, clubs and centres and community groups and communities themselves to work together to try and promote and develop outdoor learning in those places. So that's one idea, and it might bring in a more localized, place focused as well, as opposed to kind of more placeless stuff that tends to happen sometimes. Another idea is this, to change the focus away from education altogether. And for example, in this one is to focus on health and well-being instead. I suppose my point here is that education, the mainstream education sector hasn't really wanted to use outdoor education very much at all. And it could be quite an uphill battle to try and change that idea within education in Ireland. So maybe changing focus and trying to say, well, look, we can work on Healthy Ireland programs or all these different programs. We could almost get groups going in terms of addressing stuff about obesity and diabetes and all these other health issues that society has at the moment around the country. And that might be quite easy and straightforward to do in terms of it wouldn't necessarily need very much change or retraining to do that. So that's a couple of potential ideas and examples of shifts that could happen, or that we could discuss and talk about more. That's pretty much the presentation. I'm going to leave you guys with a final thought. Just 2 points here. One is, there is great potential for outdoor education to grow as a sector and become more valuable. I say more valuable, it is a valuable asset to society as it is, but we can make it even more valuable and more recognized. What change is needed for me to meet this potential? I think that's almost inarguable that things would need to change to get there. So my question to the sector would be, what will we do? There's no way we can answer that question tonight. This would only be, as Stephen was saying at the start, the beginning of a discussion. But I think that's the start. That's a good question to start with. Thanks, guys. Thanks very much for your attention there. And I hope you found that interesting and engaging. I'll hand you back over to Stephen for a minute to set us up for the next bit. Thanks very much.
That was great, JP, or Dr. John Pearce, as we should be saying. It's got that very fresh feeling to it still. We're now into the second part of the evening, and I did notice a hand going up there, and I'll try and include people as we go. But in the first part, I'd like to just concentrate on the panel and just get some questions from them and then open it out. There's quite a few questions coming in, very interesting ones. And I see another hand going up. I'll just start with the panel and then we'll integrate people from the audience as well to begin with. So just to, the panel can unmute themselves there and put on their videos, and I'll just introduce them briefly so you know who's here. So firstly, we have Kieran O'Brien. Now, Kieran is the director of Garton Outdoor Education and Training Centre, and he's previously worked in youth reach and in social care sectors, as well as a long period of time working as an instructor in the outdoor education and training centres. Ainit Carroll. Ainit is a lecturer in outdoor education on the famous course, the Shackleton course, Closh de Dulig College of Further Education, where she's program coordinator, and she has previous experience in youth work and in addictions recovery programs. And finally, Rainey Farrell. Rainey Farrell works as a youth worker and outdoor practitioner, in the Cavan Monaghan Youth Service, and she's previously worked as an instructor in an outdoor education and training centre. So I'll just hand over, maybe we get a question each from each of the panelists, their reactions, their comments, and I'll hand over maybe to Kieran firstly. And Kieran, would you have a question or a reaction for John?
Can you hear me there, Stephen?
Yeah, that's perfect, Kieran, yeah.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me. Well done and congratulations, Dr. Pearce. I don't know if I'm going to get used to calling you that now. So no, well done. Genuinely, I think I think the research is timely and welcome. The sector has recently undergone a review, and it'll be interesting to see where that takes the outdoor education and training centres from an ETBI perspective. My first question, I suppose, would be, when you talk about changes are made for logistical reasons rather than educational ones, if you were to undertake the same study in a mainstream educational setting, for example, a post-primary school or higher education setting, how much of the daily decisions would be made for educational reasons as opposed to logistical ones, do you think? As in, if you were to shadow a principal or deputy principal for the day, I think you might find that a lot of their day is taken up with managing substitution cover, classroom management, things like that. Ideally, yes, they might be looking at educational reasons for their decisions, but a lot of it will be logistical as well, possibly.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. That's a great question. Yeah, I think you could be right. We could go into another area of education and see similar logistical issues happening, or issues being to the fore all the time. I suppose two comments on that. One is, I'm not sure if that's reason enough to to say, well, it's okay for us to do it so as well. And I'm not implying that you're saying that either, Kieran, but I don't know if it's good enough to say, well, other people are like that as well, so sure, we're okay too. I think the other thing would be, for sure, maybe day-to-day principals and vice principals and all those people are dealing with these logistical issues. But go back to that guiding framework I talked about. I think, well, I don't know. I haven't done any research on it. I couldn't say. I'm not going to try and make things up, but I'd imagine there's planning meetings at different times during the year in different levels of education where they refer back to these goals and try and plan for those things to happen along the way. I'm not saying that outdoor education doesn't plan as well, but without that guiding framework, we could be doing one thing up in Donegal and something else in other places around the country that are different and have more or less effectiveness along the way. We don't know because we don't have any research to show the evidence for or against it. How does that sound, Kieran? Want to come back at me?
No, I think it's a fair point that you've made. I suppose outdoor education, more than mainstream education, it's underfunded. Do you know what I mean? So I think again we can have ideals across all of education, but sometimes maybe when you go in and examine it, you know, it may not, like if you went in and took the same sort of approach in a school, for example, you might look at a school mission statement, but if you spend a number of days in there, it might marry up just because people have an ideal in their head, but it's very difficult to achieve it for different reasons on the ground.
For sure, yeah, and I'd be the first to put my hand up and say I'm an idealist. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. No, but you do mention within the research, you know.
Yeah, and I don't go into the funding issues too much, but I do comment on the fact that any change would require support and funding from beyond what they have at the moment in the sector.
That's great, Kieran.
Thanks, Kieran.
Thanks for that question. Just to mix it up a little bit, I just take one or two questions from the question and answer box that people can use there. And the first in there was Bren Whelan, and he had an interesting one, and it's to John. Did you profile the outdoor education instructor's age, length of time in the industry, academic or outdoor qualifications when you were examining this? And he also, not to overload you there, John, but he also threw in an interesting one. Also curious whether you created a working definition of what outdoor education is.
Yeah, cheers, Brian, and thanks, Stephen, for bringing it up. I'll take the second one first. It's easier to answer. I didn't know. I didn't come up with a working definition for it. What I did do was I found all of the existing Irish definitions of outdoor education, which when I started I thought was 0, but I actually found 10 different ones. And I kind of just looked at what was already there. And so instead of adding an 11th one to it, I took the different concepts that were in that, and I tried to use down a little bit to talk about as a guide, I suppose, for what I was doing, as opposed to creating a new one. Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you exactly what they were. It's in an appendix in the thesis when it's available. You guys can have a check it out. But I talked about adventure sports, talked about environmental ed, talked about curriculum stuff, talked about field studies. There's lots of different concepts like that within all the different ones. And I looked at, I did pull them apart and see how many of them mentioned each different topic and stuff like that to try and see which ones were the more popular. But I couldn't tell you off the top of my head exactly what it was. Excuse me. And in terms of the first question, which was the profiling of the staff, I did. So myself, and I suppose before I went to that one, myself and Kevin O'Callaghan did do a Horizons article, which looked at that already. So there is going to be something there to compare those two to. I don't know if I can find the stuff here, but I did profile them. There was this is off the top of my head now, Bren and everyone else. So forgive me if I'm slightly off what it actually says in the thesis, but there was it was a 60% to 40% ish mix in male to female, so more males than females, but still 40% females was quite good in terms of adventure sports in general. There was, if I can think of anything else, quite a lot of basic award holders, not an awful lot of intermediate or advanced award holders, and very few people had a academic qualification in the area. I think it was about 8% of people had a relevant academic qualification, which was quite small. There's loads more on that. There's a whole section of a chapter devoted to profiling the staff and the practitioners.
Thanks very much, John. I'll go now to Ainat and have you a question, and you can turn on your video as well if you want to make it easier.
I think, Stephen, it says that our video isn't allowed because the host has stopped it.
Oh, right.
The power. Hang on now, we can probably fix that.
It's fine. I'm okay with that.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I guess congratulations, JP. This is a fantastic contribution to the Irish outdoor education sector. It's been a very enjoyable read. And I'm going to try and sneak in a bit of a twofer question, so you'll excuse me. So your research just talks a lot about how adventure sports are central to outdoor education provision. And I'm just interested in what you think would be the impact of us decentralizing adventure sports from outdoor education on those who already work within the field, and also perhaps on those of us who are working to prepare students to enter that field.
Okay, sure, yeah. Just give me a second to process that one, Ain't. Thanks. Yeah, no, I think, yeah, this study, the data and the findings from this study definitely show, I'm going to say, an over-reliance on adventure sports, which isn't a criticism. It's fair enough in the sense that most of the staff, like I said, 8% have an academic qualification, 100% have had adventure sports qualifications to different levels. So there's a bit of a difference there. Decentralizing it, there's lots of different things you could do. An obvious one would be sustainability. Some academics and practitioners in Europe, at least, I've talked to a few of them, would say that sustainability is the only thing we should be focused on in outdoor education. You could focus on local places and what's going on and interpreting those kind of things and learning about places. Or you can bring in loads of other models of practice. In terms of how you would do it, would it right to say you're asking how it would work in it, or is there something else?
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of thinking about, if we are to try and make that shift happen, how does that impact those of us or the staff who are already working within the centers? Okay. So kind of how that would impact them, but then also, what should those of us who are working on courses to prepare students to work in the sector be considering as well?
Sure. Okay.
If that's to happen.
Yeah, good question. So in terms of I'll go to the second bit first again, why change the routine now? I think in terms of the courses and the preparation for people coming into the sector, I think for that can change. There's process and change in all these courses for how you change things and develop them and evolve them. And while it can be a bit of paperwork, it's not that complicated most of the time, at least from the college I'm working in. We can make changes along the way to react and reflect best practice and the focus of sectors. The thing with that would be the sector would have to know what it wants to do first. So before, there's no point in Shackleton changing or the MTU down here changing what they do, or Stephen up in GMIT and his colleagues changing what they do until it's fairly set that this is the focus. We're going to focus on this and that, and here's the framework around that and the rationale and all that kind of stuff. If that was in place, it'd be, I think, fairly straightforward to refine the offerings that are out there at the moment to reflect the purpose of the sector. Until then, until then we're guessing, I suppose. We're doing our best looking at the theory and the research and knowing the sectors to do what needs to be done, but I don't think much more can happen in terms of the training before that. In terms of the existing staff, potentially, and it would depend on the model, and there's loads of different variables there. But if it was to go to a whole new model of practice, there may be some upskilling to be done or retraining to be done for some people. Other people might be already more than happily qualified to take the changes. I suppose on that one, as a final thought off the top of my head, for that to work, you'd have to bring the staff with you and not just tell them. So that idea of control in the methodization stuff would have to be slightly put to the side and the practitioners, the managers, the ETBs, whatever department they're under, and whatever focus in the community that they want to have, would have to work together to create this stuff and agree on it as they go. Otherwise, the staff wouldn't necessarily want to change, or the managers of data, or whoever else. Does that answer the question?
It does, yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Thanks, Enid.
Great, thanks, Enid and John. I might just jump back into the panel now and just pick out one here. Martin has asked, are we actually at a crossroads? Is there something or someone actively trying to bring about change? Is there some organization trying to drive change, or are the centres continuing as normal on an individual basis?
Great question. Yeah, I suppose maybe it's not at a crossroads. I'd like to think it is. I think, as Kieran said there, with the sector review that came out recently and this study coming out, I think there's a bit of an appetite, especially when you talk to the staff and the practitioners and the managers in the centres. There's an appetite there for something to be formalised, whether it's to be formalised staying the same or that we change. I don't know which is better, but I think there is some bit of an appetite there. So I'll stand over the crossroads comment. We can chat about it more if you want. And the other half was, what was it, Steve? I'm sorry.
Is there an organization or a person or an organization trying to actually drive change?
I think that's one of the, that's probably one of the issues with outdoor education as a sector, that we have loads of very good people doing really great stuff, but we never really coordinate that stuff, for want of a better word. So Kieran up in Garton is doing great stuff, Aonid's doing great stuff, Rainey's doing great stuff, Stephen does great stuff. My stuff's not too bad. But all around the country, we're doing really good stuff. And it's not necessarily, there's nothing wrong with most of what we're doing, but it's until we have that organized nature that I don't think much can really change till then. And has been tried a few times. There has been a couple of efforts to create some kind of association or organization, but they don't tend to work for, I'm not really sure why, but it hasn't worked so far.
I might put that to Kieran as well. Do you think that there's an organization that's, I suppose ETBI jumps to mind, that can help drive change, or what do you think the potential there is to create collaboration and a feeling of moving forward together? Is that?
I think that process has started. The centres and the Outdoor Education Service and City of Dublin, ETB, have come together. They're under a network now with ETBI, which is the sort of governing body for the 16 ETBs in the country. It's been a lot has happened, I suppose, in many ways. That network was only established 2 years ago. Since then, a sector review has been complete. From that, there's currently sort of plans in place, but not finalized around what steps happen next. But it's early, but I do believe that change is sort of coming slowly. That'll be ETBI or the figurehead, if you like, but I mean that goes back to the Department of Education as well, and obviously the centres themselves. So yeah, I think that is probably the collective body at the minute, but like I said, ETBI is the figurehead. Ultimately, the membership of the network are the members of the individual ETBs and the representatives from each centres. So.
Very, very good. Thanks for that, Kieran. I'll jump back into the chat box, or and there's a question here from Yannick, and he said he sees a lot of parallels in what you're saying, Dr. John Pearce, as he says, and outdoor education in other countries, which is interesting. In order to gain credibility, outdoor education in some countries has adopted many approved education methods, and with the effect of embracing issues that are seen in mainstream education, such as large amounts of paperwork for practitioners, a reduction in autonomy, and an over focus on learning outcomes and reducing teachable moments. Can you envisage a change in Irish outdoor education that straddles the fine line between not education and the already known pitfalls of public school education? And maybe just to add to that, so you had mentioned in your talk about aligning a little bit more with the curriculum. And I think Yannick's pointing out maybe some of the pitfalls in doing that.
Yeah, it's a great point. I'm not going to say I can envisage it right now because I don't know what the change could be. There's lots of different options. So yeah, there is envisageable changes that can be made, if that makes sense. But it has to be done very carefully, I think. There's a book from a couple of years ago, was it Quay and Seaman, 2013, I think, the one about outdoor education and the shifts in evolution of education in America. It went through all these cycles. And what tended to happen was, as soon as something got written down as a policy, it tended to become much more stale and not very dynamic, kind of like what Yannick is saying there. So in some ways, I think, if you want to call it a traditional policy, like they have in other sectors in terms of frameworks, mightn't be the best way to go. The Astra framework for early childcare is brilliant in a way that could just take that for every section of education in Ireland and apply it, including outdoor education. But yeah, I think it would need a lot of thought. It's a very different strand of education than the other mainstream bits. So I don't think the same policies would work as well. But I think I'd say Yannick is agreeing with me there. But yeah, I think it's very possible that it could have great changes happening, but it just has to be taken slowly and not just a reaction to, okay, quick, let's do this. It needs a bit of evidence-based stuff, and this study took over 6 years, so it's not like anything happens in a hurry in terms of research and academia. So while people might agree with what I'm saying, I'm in no way suggesting that we just go out and throw the baby in the bathwater out and start building a new bath tomorrow. It takes time to think about these things and to generate evidence to find the best solutions. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah. Thanks very much, JP. I'll go over to Rainey now. Excuse me, Rainey Farrell for a question. So over to you, Rainey.
Hey guys, and congrats, Dr. JP.
Thank you.
I think a conversation that been needed to happen for a long time. Just going back on one of your findings, and you talked a bit about purpose, and perhaps maybe a solution could be changing the name or rebranding to adventure training centers as opposed to outdoor education training centers. I'm just wondering, when the OETCs were being formed originally, was there that clear purpose from the beginning that it was specific education purpose? And if that's the case, then it's kind of seems they've gotten lost along the way, or was that never clear from the beginning?
Yeah, cheers, Rainey. That's a good one. I think the simple short answer, which I won't stick to at all, don't worry, is there was no clear purpose. From what I can gather, I wasn't there when it all started, but from the evidence that's available through documents and papers and talking to people, if you go right back to the 60s when Anton Trant started running outdoor education in Ballyfermot in the school up there, there was a very clear purpose, or at least there seems was a very clear purpose in terms of, kind of like what I was saying about the redeployment to the schools. You had these people who had these outdoor adventure skills and could help bring the teacher and the students out for different experiences. And that tended to, as it got bigger, again, it's that irrationality that comes with this McDonaldization or this commercialization, commodification stuff, that it got a bit unwieldy, and it had to take on more limiting factors, I suppose, that could allow more people to take part in it. But it kept getting bigger and bigger and more popular. And come the 80s, there was a diploma, which was a lot of PE teachers did the diploma, and they became the managers as well at these centres as they were opened through the 80s and onwards. And what happened was, instead of being what in the 60s was this localized teaching tool, it became a far off adventure sport focused thing over time, and it wasn't a purposeful thing either. So I think, yeah, there was a purpose there to begin with, but I think over time that purpose maybe got diluted and lost a bit. And even at that, some of the centres were very ad hoc in their development. There was a building. What do we do with it? We do this, and there's loads of different reasons for the different ones, but there was no necessarily agreed reason in the ETBs or the VECs at the time to develop these things with a purpose. They just kind of happened on the whim of CEOs of VCs or other people who had a lobby or a passion for it.
I think as well, you were saying that kind of focus on activity. From being an instructor in an OEC, I would have to agree that there was primarily the focus was on the activity. But also, is there a misconception towards the centres, perhaps from the teachers and the leaders when they are booking these groups in, that that's just kind of what they see that they can gain from going there, from the experience that it is? But then if that's a misconception, is that also the message that's being put out from the centres?
Yeah, it's a good observation too. Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a definite, in my experience too, and through the findings of research, there's a definite lack of understanding of the potential that the teachers could use these experiences for. And that probably is due to the fact that I'll go with the control idea from that McDonaldization thing, that once these people arrive at the centre, and everyone who's working and starts thinking to themselves when they were working with groups, the kids get off the bus or the adults get off the bus, and they're kind of controlled from then on until they get back on the bus and leave again. It's very much the timings are set, the places they go are set, all these things are controlled for them. And because the teachers don't always have that much knowledge of what they can do to almost force their goals onto the centres, if that makes sense, and not to be in a bad way, but that's the word that comes into my head. They don't have that ability because they don't know what they could do with it, because they don't see it much more than I think some of them do see a potential in it. I think they wouldn't keep coming back if they didn't see something good happening. And that's the thing, that there is good things happening in it. But to formalize that and to make it more purposeful, as to go back to your first bit of your question, there's a bit of work to be done to get there.
Great, thanks, JP. It is a related question to what Rainey asked. Tomas has just pointed out just on that idea of changing the name, and he makes a point: if the Department of Education, who are responsible for the funding, the 2.07 allocation of funding to this sector every year, is changing the name of the sector to Outdoor Adventure Training Centres a reasonable way to go forward with public provision education in Ireland?
Thanks, Tomas. I think, I could be wrong, but I think that funding has jumped to the Department of Higher and Further Education, not the Department of Education. And maybe Kieran could nod or shake his head there if I'm wrong. Stephen's nodding. Stephen nodded and Kieran shook his head. Either way,
it's under review, but
okay,
that funding is still with the Department of Education.
Right. Cool. Thanks, Kieran. It's a good point, Tomas. I think if it was going to stay in the Department of Education, and they wanted it to be as educational as possible for the people that use them, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think it's a very reasonable thing to do, is just change the name and leave it as it is. I think, it would need to do more than just change the name. But that idea of changing the name was just the first obvious conclusion I came to, going, well, as it is, it doesn't seem to be doing this, so that would be an obvious one. But I think you're right. I think if we if the Department of Education was going to keep funding them, they probably would demand more than just changing the name to Adventure Training. Even if you went to outdoor, even if you change it to Adventure Education, you'd have to define what you meant by the Adventure Education bit of it, more so than Adventure Training. I hope that gives you some answer, Tomas, but I'm not sure I can answer that one fully either beyond that.
Thanks, JP. There's a question here that's related, I suppose, to the individual working in the centre. So it really took my notice, and it says it's unlikely that there will be any changes to the way the centres in Ireland practice outdoor education, I suppose, in immediate case. So what can the individual who works in the centre practically do day to day? What questions should we be asking ourselves that can improve our session outcomes for the participant? It's a nice question, because
great
there's
question,
that autonomy that an instructor has.
Yeah, and it's a very good point as well, Stephen. There, I think something I noticed when I was doing this research was, while the instructors have a huge amount of autonomy, they don't always use it. For example, there was one person who's a level 2 kayak instructor, which means they can journey on flat water, for those who don't know that. And they were giving out that every session they did was a kind of static side session, and none of them were traveling anywhere with their group. He wasn't traveling anywhere with groups. And I just recorded it and said nothing, but at the same time, I was kind of like, well, no one's looking at you. The management can't see you. They're not making you do this static side stuff. So if you wanted to go on a journey, it's quite possible to go on a journey. Obviously within their skill set of the students in front of you and the weather and all that kind of stuff, but it is possible to change your practice. What can you do? I suppose the first thing to do is to start thinking about why you're doing what you're doing. So if you're going to ask yourself any question, ask yourself, why is this the thing I'm doing today? And how is it of benefit to these people in front of me? And if you're going to do something else, I would suggest a little bit of reading. So if you'd like academic papers, you can look them up. A top tip on those ones, you can email the author and ask them for a copy, and you don't have to spend 30 quid rent or buying it off the publishers. They're allowed to do that. So if you see one you'd like to read, email the author and they'll be more than happy to share it with you. There's a lot of good books that have come out in the last number of years. I don't have any in front of me. Some are in the picture for this website or this webinar. The one that jumped into my head, given Dr. Beams a nod, who's there somewhere, is the Adventurous Learning book from 2016. It's a small book with a blue cover if you're ever looking for it. That's a very interesting book. It has a very straightforward model that can be applied quite easily to practice in terms of giving as much agency as you can and making things relevant to the group in front of you and all that kind of stuff. And it's a very practical thing in the sense that they'll go up and down in different times. So that's quite an interesting one that is easy to comprehend and easy to apply straight away afterwards. Anything else? Yeah, ask the question why and what's the benefit, and read a bit and talk to your colleagues, and try and one last thing I'll say would be to try and not get too siloed into your own place of work. And if you can, go visit a friend somewhere else, go to their place and see what they do and see what's different or the same there, and broaden that experience up. There's 3 good ones for you, hopefully.
Great. Thanks, John. And maybe at this stage we can broaden the responses as well, not to take a bit of pressure off you, John. Here's a question. Does an outdoor education degree in Ireland really serve its intended purpose? It doesn't seem relevant based on the finding. I don't know if that's your findings, or that there's much opportunity in the future to practice OE in a professional setting. Maybe John and maybe Ainit might have some thoughts on this as well. What do you think, John?
Would you just read that again? Sorry,
does an outdoor education degree in Ireland really serve its intended purpose? It doesn't seem relevant based on the finding. I don't know if that's
okay. Yeah, I'll have a go at that one. So I would say, yeah, absolutely. A degree is very useful and very relevant, but it depends on your own perspective. The rest of you guys can jump in and tell me what you think. Because Rainey could be an interesting person to give an answer as well, because she's in the middle of doing her own degree in it as well. So that could be an interesting insight. But if you're going into work every morning just to deliver a kayaking experience and an abseiling experience and go home again, then a degree probably isn't much use to you. Absolutely. But if you've gone through and endured all these outdoor adventure experiences over years and developed yourself through it, and you want to try and get something back, then yeah, I think having those ideas that underpin practice can be quite useful. I know on the people who study on the BA outdoor learning with us, a lot of them would always say that they can take some of these things and apply it on Monday after the weekend of classes and see how it works for themselves. And sometimes they'll go, no, that's not very good, that's brilliant. And other times they'll go, that actually worked really well, I can use that. And that's brilliant as well. So I think, yeah, I think it's kind of the same with the last one that someone said about there's no change coming. It doesn't have to be a top-down change, it can be a bottom-up change as well, and it kind of meet in the middle, or even in the middle and go up and down from that. So if more people have this knowledge in terms of educational stuff and practice and how they can apply these things, and even just as simply as justifying saying, I'm doing this because it gives the students some responsibility, or it gives them a little bit of uncertainty, or it changes this, and having that support of some kind of book or theory or idea can make you feel a bit more confident about the changes you're making in your practice for the people in front of you. Don't know if anyone has any comments there.
I think for me in particular, why I chose to go down that path as well, personally, I kind of found that just running the activities just wasn't enough for me in what I wanted to do with my practice. And since taking the step to kind of, I suppose, learn more and to get more of a deeper understanding of what I can do with my practice, and to hopefully, as you said, kind of use it as an aid. It's the person that I have the interest in. And I guess there's been a shift in my practice that maybe I'm kind of using the outdoors now in a bit more of a holistic approach. The activities are great and I love them, but I guess I was just looking for something a bit deeper to kind of progress personally as an outdoor practitioner, and it's kind of taken me along that path.
Ines, would you?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I would agree. I think as soon as a lot of us decide at some point that we want to move beyond just the pure delivery activity, I think that's where the degrees really support and help us develop. And I think major positive that come people progressing on and studying an outdoor education degree is we get to move beyond perhaps the enculturation that is developed through, if we're just doing our training courses and then we're sometimes replicating what we've done. The degrees encourage us to move beyond that and explore our what we're doing and why we're doing it and how we're doing it. And then that allows us to be more authentic in our practice. And that's where I see the massively important for us progressing.
Great, thank you for those responses. I'll just maybe jump down a bit through the questions and come back up again. And a question from Joe Fitz, all the way from Edinburgh, wondering, is there an awareness of the potential of outdoor education in schools? If schools just see it as an adventure sports experience that happens in a different place from the school, and then that is what outdoor centres provide them, wondering, can it evolve to include learning outside the classroom, place-to-place learning, environmental education? The possibility of instructors working in schools to facilitate outdoor learning and applications to the curriculum is great and would be welcomed, and could weave in the health and well-being focus. So, you know, I might open that to everybody as well, because I think some of the centres are going to schools as well, but maybe could start with yourself, John.
Yeah, it's one of the many chicken and egg kind of conversations you can have with outdoor education in Ireland. Yeah, I think a lot. I don't want to paint every single teacher with the same brush there, but a lot of teachers buy into outdoor education, and I suppose learning outside the classroom, if you want to call it that, for any amount of names if you want to use, but they do a lot of it, and I've a number of friends who work in schools, and they do great work outside of the classroom in the outdoors. The first step for that to happen, I think, Joe, would be that the centres, the practitioners, and us as a whole sector would have to start thinking beyond what we always automatically think of as outdoor education. As in, you don't need to be a mountain leader to keep a group safe in the woods for an hour. That'd be a bit overkill in some ways. Maybe there's a new qualification needed there to allow safety and facilitation outdoors or something. But yeah, I agree. I think the scope for expanding practice is huge. Place-based stuff, the environmental stuff, and all the sustainability ideas. There's great focus in those things that could allow for more diverse practice. It just depends. Again, it's one of those hard ones that there's so many choices. What do you do? I don't think you can pick them all. I don't think you could have a sector that does amazing place-based stuff, amazing environmental stuff, and amazing learning outside the classroom stuff, and sustainability stuff, and adventure stuff, and curriculum stuff, and health stuff. That'd be mad. Be pulled in too many directions. So I think you'd have to choose one primary kind of focus, or agree on one primary focus, and maybe have 2 or 3 associated ones that could be useful as well, and focus on those. It doesn't mean you can't do the other ones. It just means you'd be driving to a certain agenda. And once you chose that, you could see, okay, what training do staff need to facilitate this the best, and what other things need to happen in terms of maybe the Department of Education running upskilling or in service for its existing teachers, and changing the training for its to be soon to be teachers to allow for this integration of practice. What else do you guys think?
I actually had a conversation once with a primary school teacher, and we were just kind of talking about kind of the differences of what we do, and she said for her to bring a group of primary school children out into a forest would be a terrifying concept because they're out in the wilderness. And I was like, well, for me to contain a group of young people within 4 walls is a terrifying concept for me. So I think there is a need where we can share and combine and work together for sure, and kind of learn from each other in that sense. That would be amazing. It would be a perfect world if we could bring that into the educational system.
There is evidence to support that. There's a paper by Sean Blenkinsop, John Telford, and a few others. I think it's 5 surprising findings, something like that, that outdoor experience educators have compared to mainstream teachers. It's quite an interesting read. It's not based in Canada, but it's exactly what you're saying, really. That's part of it.
Mm.
Kieran, what do you think about part of Josie's question was this idea of outreach, maybe bringing adventure or learning outside the classroom to the school? What do you think of that?
I think in theory it's a very good idea. I think JP has touched on a little bit that there's probably, I'm not going to be stereotypical, but there is a fear amongst a lot of teachers and educators to move outside the confines of the schoolyard. They might go out into the yard, but that's as far as they go. Equally, I suppose, going back from the centre perspective, it's the traditional supply and demand. So if you talk to a primary teacher, for example, where their funding is very, very limited, and you say, well, we're a self-financing centre, so we need to charge you X amount for us to do that, they're kind of going, oh, surely there's a way for us to access that, for free, So basically, going back to the centres where the primary school for their 6th class school tour traditionally in June, where they want to avail of adventure activities, they're ready to pay for that. Do you know what I mean? And the funds are there, and parents see that as something, yeah, I'm happy to pay X amount for my child to do that. Whereas it might be a harder sell for parents to be paying the same amount for some facilitator to come in to accompany the teacher into the woods, for example. So I think that's shifting. It's changing slowly, and I can see some people have put up some good stuff there in the chat in relation to, like, green schools are very involved, forest schools, Department of Marine. There is funding there, but ultimately it requires more funding as opposed to people paying, or a huge amount of people ready to pay that amount of money for that service. Whereas at the minute the demand is there for the service, which is primarily adventure activities. And as John quite rightly pointed out in his research, if you look at the general societal view of the outdoor education centres in people's heads, it's, well, that means adventure sports. Now, maybe we like to think there's a little bit more going on than just the adventure sports, but that is the societal view, and that's the societal demand. And I suppose it boils back down to what people are willing to pay, really, for a service that isn't funded, it's self-financing. Don't know if that answers your question or not.
Great. No, thanks very much. We're just in the last 10 minutes now, so I might just pick out one or two of the shorter ones. It's great to see the chat boxes working away with a lot of people answering the questions themselves, which is very great use of agency there. But just there's one here from Matt, and it's an interesting one. It kind of links to some of the conversations we've already had, and he said, John, was there any research that you found or carried out about the expectations of groups coming to the centres?
I see that there, yeah. So any research carried out on about expectations? It's a great question. Nothing comes into my head, to be honest. I don't know if any of Stephen or Raymond have any thoughts there either, but one thing I noticed, I suppose I'd read a lot of the research and papers and books before I started this study, but when I went with a focus to it, I found, it's something I found quite curious, that the vast majority of the research out there focuses on kind of one-off programs or something that's never been reproduced in terms of program outcomes. So what are the benefits or the outcomes of these programs? And very little talks about the practice involved or the expectations of the students or even the instructors and management and teachers. There probably is something out there somewhere. I'd imagine someone's done something on it, but nothing that I've come across or can remember. Stephen, Maynard, or anyone else, I don't know if you have any ideas there.
No, not on expectations.
Just to maybe extend out a little bit further while I think of it. Just because it's not there, or just because, let's say, as a researcher, I'm too busy to do it, that doesn't mean that a centre can't do these things themselves. If you guys are interested in finding out the expectations of the students coming to your centres, or the teachers, or whoever, there's no reason you can't come up with some kind of way of doing that and recording it. I know I can be quite busy at times in the year, but if you send me on your ideas, I'd gladly help when I have time to fashion the questions or to put it together in the most useful way to work with you. I have no problem doing that as long as I have a bit of time on my hands. But yeah, that's the other, I suppose, potential thing, that people can embrace these things themselves and say, okay, well, there's nothing on that, we don't know anything about it, let's figure it out for ourselves. And I suppose most questions like that, from an Irish context, there's no information, there's no evidence generally for Irish outdoor education, even the broader scope of it beyond the public centres. So there's opportunities to do more ourselves, I suppose.
Great, thanks, John. We'll just squeeze in a few quick ones. I can see the chat box is going very quickly, so it's great. Part of the dialogue that I suppose informs practice and debate expands practice. Here's a nice one from Alvin. How do we go about creating an outdoor education framework across Ireland going forward, where outdoor educators, facilitators have guidance from a body or a network in terms of what kind of standards, qualifications are expected when delivering outdoor education centres? And whose responsibility is this to create this framework? Is it government, colleges, or outdoor educators?
A lot of question marks. How do we go about creating a framework? I suppose to start with a discussion, we could say that this is a good opportunity to start more of a discussion around the bigger picture of what outdoor education is and should be and could be and all that kind of stuff. So I think starting with a discussion is probably the best way to go. I think that discussion needs to involve everybody as much as possible, or at least a voice from every stakeholder. So you could talk to the students that come to the centres, you talk to the teachers and leaders that bring them, their parents, the staff in the centres, the management of the centres, the ETBs themselves, the department itself, and try and get all this information, which is some of it is in that review that came out recently, which grew some great information in. And lost my train of thought there now. But yeah, start with that discussion and start trying to figure out that stuff. And if people did take on that idea of questioning the relevance and why we're doing this and what else is going on, I think that could be an interesting conversation to start things off. In terms of a body or network, yeah, some kind of association could be quite good. We've been very slow as a sector to take it on. There's been 2 or 3 attempts I know of to do this, and it hasn't happened so far. It hasn't really got beyond the initial setting it up thing for different reasons. I'm not sure why. think maybe that would come in time. We might be too early to try that right now. And in terms of qualifications and standards, I suppose from a public point of view, if they're under the Department of Education, like Tomas was talking about there, that they probably do have a bit of a responsibility to regulate something, and the ETBs would be in there as well in terms of some kind of standards and minimum qualifications and that kind of stuff.
No, that's great, JP. Thanks very much. We're just about 3 minutes left. So before handing back to you, JP, maybe for a little, some closing thoughts, there's just one of the, I was trying to juggle things here, but just one of the last chats that came in, I think it might be worth calling out. Well done, JP, and congratulations. It's from Joanna McInerney. Lots of food for thought. There is a movement for review and change within the OETC centres. Collaboration is a key going forward. There's a lot of valuable outdoor education work and collaboration beg your pardon, happening currently, but more work to be done for sure. So I might just, I know I haven't got to all the questions, so apologies for that. It's probably better to leave with loads of questions rather than to be have gone to silence. Right, so I'll just hand over to JP for some closing thoughts and ideas. And just from my own behalf, thank you very much and for coming along. And it's been very lively discussion happening there. Very hard to keep up with, but I think very worthwhile at the same time. So JP, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Stephen. And Stephen, thanks for agreeing to moderate, and to Rainey, Aenid, and Kieran for being on the discussion panel. And it was great to see the discussion happening. I didn't get to read much of the other comments or chat bits there. Hopefully I get to see them afterwards. But there's a certain optimism in that idea of how passionate people are about it, and how open people seem to be in the comments about potential change that could happen. I don't want to labor the points too much. I've kind of said a lot of what I wanted to say, or what the study says in it. I suppose I'll just thank you all for coming and engaging with the webinar. It sounds like people found it interesting. Going back to Stephen's point at the start about the academic, the role of the academic, I think the main purpose we're trying for here was to share the findings of the study and also hopefully start some discussion. And I think we might have started a lot of discussions there. Long may they continue, and long may we develop these ideas and develop practice in Ireland to be more and more valuable all the time. And I suppose I think we might have met that aim or the purpose. And hopefully it won't just finish when we press leave in a minute. Hopefully the ideas or the discussions here in this webinar will start spreading these ideas of change, and even just ideas of discussion and questions, critical questions around the sector. If that happens, it'll all be totally worth it. Yeah, thanks very much, and good night.
I just note, John, a few people are looking for links to the recording, which I think we can do. And,
yeah.
Ovin wants some bedtime reading and wants a copy of your doctorate. So
you must be finding it hard to sleep, Ovin, or yeah. So the recording will be available soon. It has to download. I'll put it up on YouTube soon, and I'll share the link with people. And hopefully it'll be interesting to go back through again at some stage. And the thesis itself, I think everyone has my email address. If you want it, you can email me. I can send you a copy. It won't be available online through the university for a while yet, I don't think. I think it's not only after you graduate that it goes up online. So it could be a few months. But yeah, I'll happily share with anyone who wants it. That's no problem at all.
Great. Thanks, JP.
Cheers, guys. I'll turn it all off. Thanks, guys.